So we'll start with Ben Franklin.
Turkey.
Yes, amazing.
He wanted a turkey.
Ben Franklin was adamantly opposed to the inclusion of an eagle, which is in this Great Seal today. And instead, he wanted a turkey. And he thought that the turkey was more American. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of WTF History. This is the show where we teach you those amazing facts of history that are simply not taught in schools. I am your co-presenter, Mike Gatto, and we're here with my co-host, David Quintana.
Hey, how you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great.
I'm ready.
Today, we are covering WTF moments from colonial America. This is a great period of our nation's history, of course, the formative years of our nation. And David's got it. When he told me that the outlines, my mind was blown. I think y'all are going to really be interested in this. David?
Yeah, what I'm going to talk today about is one, Nova Scotia, Acadia, and how the Acadians have become those people a complete continent apart, as we know as the Cajuns down in Louisiana. I like to think as Acadia, which is an isthmus. I hate that word, man.
You always got to pause like,
yeah. There's like Halifax and, all of these like Port Royal of Nova Scotia. So there's a long, long history here. And we're not going to go over that. We go over some of it. But to be honest, as I did my research, I have figured out I see Acadia like a poor child who's really hardworking and earnest. And it has two really bad parents going through a really bad divorce. And like, now you're a dad. Now you're with mom. Follow dad's rules. Follow mom's rules. And poor Acadians are just trying to get along, right? They're just trying to be earnest and do their job. Grow some barley and and Brit and England and France just can't help themselves. Over a period of time, I think Nova Scotia and what we know as Acadia, I think that transferred at least 6 times between the French and the British, because of all the different wars that went on there. You can kind of see it like, if you know English history, they have a thing called the borderlands. And those are lands that bordered Wales and they bordered Scotland in the north.
Sure.
And those lands would go back and forth all the time, right? So it's a kind of a good way to look at Acadia as kind of a borderland. That always, here come the English, no, here come the French. Believe it or not, the Dutch were there for a little bit. They had a little colony called New Holland.
Crazy.
And but that was just like a minute, not even worth our time. So if you know where Acadia is, it's up on the very northern tip above Maine in what is now Nova Scotia. And people had been fishing because it has very, very bountiful fishing fields out there. And people had been fishing there since at least the 1500s. Fleets had been coming out there. So like over 100 years before the Pilgrims even arrived, right? There were people fishing up there in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, and there were settlements. There were English speaking, French speaking, Dutch speaking, but all these fleets had little settlements and little communities up in that area. Mike, that's one thing that I think is interesting about history, because in the United States, I think our children are taught that before the Pilgrims arrived, right, at Plymouth Rock, that all of this was empty except for the indigenous people. But they forget, like, the Spanish had been here like for almost 100 years before that, right, down in Florida and parts of New Mexico. And then up there in the far north, like the Dutch, the English, the French, they had been there for like 100 years. So anyway, I think people forget about that. In 1604, the French put some colonies there, trying, because it was good land if you could claim the land. Didn't work out much. They kind of had to leave. But in the 1630s, Jacques Cartier, he came in. And in the 1630s to the early 1640s, he really claimed that land for France. And the French began colonizing there in earnest. They came from like southwest France, and they would settle in there. They were Catholic French. And
so these were not Huguenots. These were Catholics. These were French.
These were Catholic, yeah. And that's important. That's important. And so they were Catholic French. They reclaimed a lot of the land. A lot of the land was marshy, because they have very, very dramatic tides in that area. The Bay of Fundy is over there. And I think we all know how, the Bay of Fundy has the largest tidal differences. So there were very dramatic tides. So they were able to reclaim a lot of land in Acadia, and Acadia became a very, very fertile place under the hard work of these Acadians, these French Catholics who began to come in there and really turn it over into very productive land. So at the same time, the Acadians began to create a really very good relationship with the Mi'kmaq tribe. Those are the indigenous people that had been there throughout that area for countless eons, and they actually had a really good relationship with them. And then obviously there were spats here and there, and they were up, just like anywhere else, but in the whole, I think all historians have agreed that the Mi'kmaqs and the Acadians, the French Catholic Acadians, that they had a very good relationship and they helped each other. And trust me, I'm not the kind of guy to look at this through rose-colored glasses. I actually, I tested this and researched it, and yeah, they did. They actually had a good relationship. They were allies, and they were allies because they hated the English. So throughout this entire time, this land, this place, the Acadia, Nova Scotia, it went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between the English and the French, at least what we know 6 times.
Sure.
So at least 6 times. And by the way, Nova Scotia, the name from Nova Scotia, that means New Scotland. And that was James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. He wanted to put a colony there for England. And so he did a charter and he underwrote a company to go out there, and they called it Nova Scotia.
Fresh
so that's where they get
failures from the Darien Gap.
yeah, right. And what's funny is that
show them what they could do.
The Scots actually went out there and did a little bit of a colony, and they said, F it. They ended up leaving.
This is a reference to an excellent episode that we did on Scotland's failed colony at the Darien Gap in Panama. Let's send a bunch of Scots to Panama. It didn't work out, as you might be surprised. But
yeah,
anyway,
the worst idea for a colony ever. So over a period of time, they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Throughout this time, as I said, I see the Acadians as a poor, battered child with these 2 horrible parents who can't make up their mind who owns this land. And, I want the kid, you want the kid, I want the kid, you want the kid. So throughout this time, the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq, they created this relationship like, hey, anybody but them. So after a period of time, we got a governor of the area called Governor Charles Lawrence. And this was in I'd say he came around in the 1750s. So remember, these guys, you had generations. You had Acadians who had been there for over 130 years, right? It's like if we look back, and I've had family here in this spot, right, since 1890. It's the same. Because of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, whichever you prefer to call it, between England and France, they began to not trust the Acadians because of their French background and because they were Catholic. So New England was going through a very severe depression. They were getting an influx of new colonists, and they didn't have room for them because they're backed up against the mountains there, right? I mean, you got to remember, New England was not that big. You were kind of bordered in by the mountains to the west. So they're looking up at Acadia and all of this land, all of this very, very fertile land, and going, hey, that looks really good. So they began talking to the British governor for the area and saying, hey, I don't think you can trust those Acadians. I think if, in this war here with the French, these guys are going to take the French side. And so Governor Lawrence decides, well, I need to make all of them take an oath of loyalty to the king. Well, this was really problematic because Britain was Protestant, right? Well, they weren't Catholic. Because they were, also Anglican. So they weren't Catholic. It was a real problem for the Acadians because a lot of them took a lot of pride in their French background. They didn't consider themselves French, by the way. They considered themselves Acadian. But they did take a lot of pride in their French background, and they didn't like the English. The English didn't treat them very well. And also what they were concerned about is taking an oath to the crown of England would make them liable to have to fight the tribe, the Mi'kmaq. And they didn't want to do that either. Those were their brothers. And there was a lot of intermarriage at that time with the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians. So on August 15th, 1755, the British expulsion campaign began, the Great Upheaval. And what happened was that the British came in and they rounded up those that they had not already imprisoned. A lot of the men they had imprisoned for refusing to take the loyalty oath, and then the British militia came in with the British from the forts in the area, because remember it was a borderland, so you had a lot of British forts, and they gathered up all of the families and gave them no time to get anything, just grab what you can. And in fact, there are some good quotes with Robert with John Winslow saying, "And hey, don't allow them to grab to encumber our ship with all their rubbish. Just like whatever they can grab, you put them on." Families were split up. The Acadians are split up. They had very, very, very big extended families, as you would. They've been there for like 130 years on this island, working together, living together. So they had large extended families. What the British did was they split them up without care towards who went with who. And one of the reasons was because they did not want them to create new Acadian communities wherever they took them.
Jeez.
They wanted to ensure that they could not recreate what they had in Acadia.
And I'm going to step in here and I'm going to say, again, this is why we study history. It's because you hopefully see some patterns with what's going on in the present world. And folks, this technique is as old as the hills. It's as old as history itself, and it still occurs today, which is group over here. We're going to say you are different. It could be ethnically different, could be ideologically different, it could be religiously different. You are different. And now you need to say what we tell you to say. You need to parrot what we want. In this case, it's an oath, it's some other pretext, whatever. You need to do what we want and show that you're going to behave. Otherwise, there's consequences. And the consequences are we've got this other group that economically really covets what you got. So we're going to send them after.
Yeah, and Governor Shirley, who again was the governor of the Massachusetts colony, he gave his blessing for this. John Winslow put the militias together, and Governor Lawrence up in Acadia, he allowed the expulsion to happen so that they could get good British folk in that valley. They burned down the houses. The other thing that they did, which I found very, very interesting, was they burned all the property records, because they did not want the Acadians to return and make a claim on their property. So they knew that if they burned all the property records from the towns, that it would be almost impossible for them to say, "Look, this land has been in my family for 100 years." The other thing to remember, and I can't say this enough, they had been there for like 130 years. They had been there, like, you know what I mean? I mean, that's like 8 generations they had been there. And they were just honestly picked up. So many of them in the beginning thought, oh, well, they're going to take us to France, or they're going to take us to a French colony, but they didn't. They took them to British colonies because they did not want them to be able to get together again with other French people. So they put them in places they weren't wanted. The other part of this was they were not prisoners of war, right? Because they weren't soldiers. So they were governed by the poor laws where they took them. So they would take them to North Carolina, or they would drop them off in Georgia, again, with no regard to the families being kept intact. They would drop these Acadians off in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. There, they would fall under the poor laws. And in most cases, they were sold off to be indentured servants. So you had these very proud people who had a very proud culture and had just turned this bad land into very fertile land, which ended up being a curse upon them. And they were now indentured servants down in the humidity of Georgia.
Jeez.
Another part of this is that they had no community immunity to a lot of diseases that were rampant in the South, right? Your typhoid, your smallpox, your measles. They didn't have any immunity to that because they didn't have that up on the island. It was a very closed community, them and the Mi'kmaq. And, the British and French would come in and out.
It sounds like they had intermarried with the Native Americans too. So, you have people who are part Native and...
But when they dropped them off in these hot, humid temperatures of Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, right up and down the coast, which is what they did, that's where they would drop them, they would immediately become sick and die of yellow fever. There's one story of a ship that came, and they would not allow them off the ship because they had become sick. So most of them ended up dying on that ship. They had to spend a winter on the ship with only the clothes on their backs and the food that the crew might think of giving them. these were poor people. I mean, they were not poor, but these poor people had been doing nothing but just farming their land up, in Acadia. So at the end of the day, they dropped them off. Some of them went back to England. By 1758, over what's the number that I have? By 1758, I believe 15,000 Acadians had been shipped out in the Great Exile.
Wow.
They had just been put on ships and taken away. Some of them never, ever saw their families. There's a story of one of the ships that was forced to go to England because Georgia did not want them. So the ship had to go sail the ocean to England. It ended up in a wreck in the middle of the Atlantic, and everybody on board died.
Jeez.
There was one family, because they had extended families, one family that happened to be together had over 100 people on that ship. Their entire family line died in the middle of the Atlantic because they were refused port in Georgia.
Jeez.
Throughout all of this, because remember, when they started rounding the people up, word spread. And so many of the Acadians on the other side of the island were like, oh, hell no. And they began running off and either went to a French fort or they went into the mountains of New Brunswick or, Newfoundland or, some of the islands out there. And there they waged a guerrilla war. And their leader was a guy named Beausoleil or Joseph Broussard. For 3 years, from 1755 to 1758, Beausoleil led a very, very ugly, fierce guerrilla war, terror, really, against the British invasion there. And he was eventually captured, put in prison. And then in 1764, he was released at the end of the 7 Years' War. He then got on a ship. He was able to charter a ship with 200 other Acadians. And that ship went down to the Spanish colony of Louisiana.
Okay.
And Louisiana said, oh, well, we need people. Come on, Beausoleil. Yeah, we'll gladly take your people, because they had a lot of land, but they didn't have a lot of people, which was typical for the Spanish colonies, right? They didn't have a lot of Spanish colonists. They had soldiers and like the indigenous folks.
Right.
So they were very happy to see the Acadians come. They were happy to see Broussard. And they gave Broussard and the Acadian people he brought with him all of this land in southwest Louisiana to farm. And they were able to do what they did because, remember, Mike, I told you that they had reclaimed all of this land with dikes and dams because of, the tides. So they knew how to tame the Mississippi River, right, and all of its tributaries. So they were able to turn the southwest Louisiana land into very fertile land. They also became the first cowboys because they had cattle in this area. So you're talking to 1700s, way before you see the cowboys out like in the movies, right?
Right.
The Cajuns actually were the first cowboys in southwest Louisiana. Broussard was the guy that brought all of that to Louisiana. I think he is the grandfather of the Cajuns, of the Cajun society down in Louisiana. Yeah, as other Cajuns up and down the eastern seaboard found out what was happening in southwest Louisiana and the Cajun culture and society that was having a renaissance there, they all came and they wanted to be there. And the Spanish were happy to have them because they needed they were very successful agriculturalists.
And I'm sure it was a plus that they were Catholics who hated the British, right? It's like, oh, that's a plus, right?
That was a plus.
Yeah,
they were Catholics, right? So it all worked out. So anyway, I have found that to be one of the most interesting stories I've done. I skipped over a lot of history because you could have a 5-hour show just on all the wars that happened where, Nova Scotia and Acadia went back and forth. It was not my intent to give you that history. It was my intent to give you the history of the people and how they got down there.
This is one of the deepest vignettes that I've heard from you. And I had no idea. I mean, again, you've done this a few times in the show where here's a guy who, I read a lot of history. I had no idea. I had this loose sense that the Cajuns were French. That's it. I had no idea that they had come from what is now Canada. And I'm ashamed to admit this. I should have known this story, but what a fascinating story. What a sad episode in the history of the United States or predecessor to the United States.
Really, I think, I think it's really the first case of government-sanctioned ethnic cleansing in North America. What happened to the Native Americans was just a straight genocide. Yeah. But here you had an actual government-led ethnic cleansing against a people, and anyway. I'll let that speak for itself. And Mike, so what do you have?
So I'm going to go talk about the same era, American history and to talk about a fascinating quirk about American history that I never knew. And it also involves the weird and fragile ethnic composition of our early United States. So first, I'm going to say, look, it's on passports. It's on the back of the $1 bill. What is it?
Pyramid?
No, it's the Great Seal of the United States. Yes, and there is a little pyramid as part of it.
Yeah.
And people say, well, what is the Great Seal of the United States? Well, it's the coat of arms of the United States. Documents that require to be stamped to this day with the Great Seal of the United States include treaties, international agreements, the appointment of every ambassador, even to the Bahamas, has to be sealed with the Great Seal. Communications from the president to foreign governments have to be sealed with the Great Seal of the United States. So it's sort of, it's how we sign letters as a country, and it's the coat of arms of the United States. And a lot of us have kind of vaguely remember some conspiracy theories having to do with the Great Seal of the United States, right? This is some Da Vinci Code shit, right? This is the idea that the Eye of Providence that sits atop the pyramid that David talked about, that's some Freemason symbol or something like that. We've also heard that the motto that says on there, where they say a new order for the ages, that is some kind of reference to a new world order, and that's been bastardized into a new world order. There's all sorts of theories. In my humble opinion, they're nonsense. But very, very few people know about the drafting process and the real history of the Great Seal. All right, so first of all, it was a 6-year process. This is how much the founding fathers wanted to get it right. And the founding fathers actually thought this was so important because a new nation needs to, communicate officially and seal documents, that they appointed a committee to create the Great Seal on July 4, 1776. And who did they appoint? Well, they appointed 3 little poorly known guys, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, right? So as
Rookies.
Yeah. And as you can imagine, these very opinionated and accomplished guys, they had different opinions about what should be in the Great Seal. So we'll start with Ben Franklin.
Turkey.
Yes, amazing.
He wanted a turkey.
Ben Franklin was adamantly opposed to the inclusion of an eagle, which is in this Great Seal today. And instead, he wanted a turkey. And he thought that the turkey was more American. It's indigenous to the United States. It's a tough bird. He also thought that it was more noble than a bald eagle. He thought that it didn't steal food from other predators and so on and so forth. What was very interesting, too, is that he did not want the motto to be E pluribus unum, but instead he wanted the motto to be rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, right?
I like it.
Which would be a little bit aggressive, right? But
yeah. He was good at a party.
He was good at a party. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who was going through I guess you could call it a phase or perhaps a personality quirk. Thomas Jefferson was obsessed with the Anglo-Saxons. And by the Anglo-Saxons, I don't mean like the
King Harold
British. I mean, the real Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribe. And so he wanted the Great Seal to feature Hengist and Horsa, 2 German warriors who legend had it led the Anglos and the Saxons and the Utes to their invasion of Britain in the 5th century.
They were mercenaries that later took over.
Pirates, he wanted to feature 2 semi-legendary pirate kings. Now, John Adams, curiously, wanted the seal to feature Hercules. He thought that Hercules' labors, his mythical labors, were an analogy of the United States' struggles with Britain and with other things. But the 3 of them, kind of got together and they're like, look, we can't agree. We have very little experience in heraldry because this is a coat of arms, and there's every country had a coat of arms. Every family had it. Yeah. So they sought the help of a guy named Pierre Eugène du Cimetière, who was a Swiss artist living in Philadelphia. And they went to him and he said, okay, well, let's put up the Eye of Providence. They eventually adopted that. He also suggested the adoption of the motto E pluribus unum, which we're all familiar with, which means out of many, one. And they said, okay, great. You're getting some consensus here. Start design. And in August 1776, du Cimetière showed his design and revealed it to them, which was more along conventional heraldic lines. And the shield on the draft was really pretty. It had 6 sections. Now, One shield had a beautiful rose. One shield had a thistle. One shield had a harp. One had a fleur de lis. One had a lion rampant. And the final shield had an imperial eagle. And when they asked him, they said, hey, Pierre Eugène, what are you getting at here? And he said, well, I'm putting on the US coat of arms, the symbols of the countries from which these United States have been peopled. This was a letter he wrote to them. The rose was for England, the thistle for Scotland, the harp for Ireland, the fleur de lis, of course, was for France, the lion was for the Netherlands, and the imperial eagle, fascinating, was for the Holy Roman Empire. You know, at that time, Germany, before it was Germany, right? So this committee now, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, they make a few tweaks, but they vote unanimously to adopt this design. And they send it to Congress. Congress, however, somebody gets up and makes a motion to lie the design on the table. And us procedural nerds know what that means. They essentially tabled it, rejected this design. 3 years later, Congress says, we really need a new seal. This design's been laying on the table. No one's brought it up for a motion again. And they appoint a second committee. And the second committee makes their recommendations. And they recommend, among other things, that the seal include a Native American warrior holding a bow and arrow. And the words for war or for peace, which was, you know, just kind of fascinating, right? I love the inherent contradiction in that. Goes up again for a vote in Congress. Congress again rejects it. So now both designs are out there and Congress can do either one. So it's now 2 years later and Congress is like, we really need a seal. We really need an official stamp for our documents. The nation is 6 years old. You need a friggin' seal. Like, here are the details. Like, Congress again gets a proposal. They again reject it. So now 3 proposals have been proposed and rejected. The original is still sitting there. That's a pending motion. You have 3 powerful people who are now sort of legends in the new country who are behind this first original draft. But finally, Congress appoints their own secretary, the Secretary of Congress, to the matter. And he draws these elements from all 3 drafts. And later that year, Congress approves the seal that we use today. But this is what has blown me away. And I don't know if this is, I don't know if I'm going to express this as much as it kind of shocks me, but it does shock me, right? Now, you recall that the first draft, the gut instinct of this new nation, the draft that was approved unanimously by this stellar committee of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin. They wanted to incorporate in our coat of arms the flags of 6 nations, the symbols of 6 nations. That was England, Ireland, Scotland, France, the Netherlands, and Germany. And that would not be so jarring because the nation at that time was peopled
right
from those countries. But here's something that should blow your mind because it blows mine. Here we are 200 however many years later since our country started. There has never been
a president
from not those 6 countries. And folks, you know what about Barack Obama's mom was 100% of English, Scottish, Irish, and German ancestry. And I'm not,
wow,
you know, because whatever, but I just want to, fathom that this guy sat down and he wrote these 6 nations.
Yeah, right.
And these guys were like, yeah, that represents our country. And every single president to this day in this diverse country has been from those heritage, from
one of those 6 countries.
And when I say that, I say, like, there hasn't been a single person with a smidge of Polish blood or a little bit of Italian.
Yeah, right. No, yeah.
History. I mean, obviously we know these things, but and so, I mean, it's sort of a joke, right? Did the original draft of the seal put a curse on people who are not from these 6 countries?
Let me ask you a question. Yeah. So would she break that streak?
She would break that streak. As far as I know, I haven't done her genealogy, folks, but I've heard some things that on her Jamaican side, she might have some part. I don't know.
British?
Yeah, I don't know, but she would break that streak.
Hold it. She does come from 2 what were British colonies. right?
We're
India
British colonies,
and,
but
and
having
Jamaica.
somebody of Indian heritage obviously would be a
Uh-huh.
first, and it would be a nation
Okay.
that's not represented on those original six. But it really just blew my mind that like they could sit down and make this thing, and it would be so foretelling of history, even to this.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. That's a good story, man.
Yeah,
That's good. I thought you were going to say that that is actually a turkey and not an eagle. And,
no,
like I was like, yeah, Benjamin Franklin.
that would be an
It's my
amazing.
boy. That guy was great, man. That's a good story, Mike. I did not know that, and I think that makes the election a little more
Fascinating,
interesting to
right?
see if that streak gets broken. But I really do want to see a genealogy test because she does come from two pre. So somebody might say that technically she keeps the streak going because her ancestors come from what were part of Britain at one time,
That
right?
would be interesting.
I don't
I
know.
would, I would respectfully disagree with her. I think her election would be extraordinary. But I will say, like, what would clearly break this would be like to have some random Polish guy get elected president, right? Or like somebody like who was like part Slovakian or something, right?
Yeah, yeah, I get it. I get it. Yeah, like Lech Walesa.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah,
yeah, right.
it's just so strange, right? Someone who
So
had
you're slicing up the white guys.
well, I mean,
You're like,
it blows my mind, right? I mean, we all know that the history of our country. There was a long period where
right,
there was a lot of institutionalized discrimination, and it could
mhm,
only be Europeans. But it's fascinating that even within that, there wasn't somebody who was like a little bit Spanish, right? I mean, it's just
right. No, you're right. Yeah.
like amazing,
Uh huh.
right? It's those
No,
originals.
it's more interesting. Like there hasn't been anybody who was like, Austro-Hungarian, right? Because I mean that was a
Yes,
huge country at one time.
precisely.
Dude, that was good. Good episode, man. Good
Thank
episode.
you.
You brought it.
We want you all to like us, subscribe to this, tell your friends, post this episode, share it. Good things should be shared. Please share this episode.
All right, man. See y'all guys next time.
See you guys next time.
Hey, if you like what you hear, like and subscribe. It really means a lot, and we would love to have you coming back every week. Thank you.